Brexit. It's going to happen eventually, or maybe not. Meanwhile, we'll argue over what Brexit means. Does Brexit mean Brexit, or does it mean Brexit? Because who knows what Brexit is? Do we care anymore? Can we take much more of it? More importantly, is it a good idea or a really bad idea, or somewhere in between? If you are confused, annoyed, jubilant, or disinterested, or on the verge of a mental breakdown from overexposure to Brexit, we'll look at it from two people who come at it from different directions. That's me and Steve Keen. That is today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Yeah, before we talk Brexit, let's talk about last week, first of all, because I made an error. Yes, I know. Steve was trying to remember the man behind the internet, and I said Berners-Lee. So thank you, Bijou Smith, for pointing out that Berners-Lee wasn't the man he invented HTTP, of course. So that makes him the inventor of the World Wide Web, not the internet. So maybe I should have said Vint Cerf, perhaps, or maybe I should have just kept my mouth shut, which is probably what I should have done. Now, Brexit. We have largely avoided it on this podcast. We're hoping it would go away, but it won't. Not anytime soon. And, I guess we had to get to it sometime because we've been doing this podcast, Steve Keen and I, for 2 years or more. And, well, actually well over 2 years. I think we're up to 3 years now. Yeah. And you know what, Steve? I don't think I've looked through the list. I mean, we've touched on the subject. We have not done a full podcast on Brexit. So I thought now everyone is bored to the back teeth with it. That's the time for us to pounce and start talking about it.
I'm still finding it hard to process that. I mean, you and I, we were on other sides of the vote when it first happened. We had a few. We've never actually done a podcast.
No, we haven't.
Brexit.
So let's get it. I think because we knew it was going to be ugly. And so now, we knew Brexit was going to be ugly, but if we did a podcast on it, because we've got slightly different views, although I think we've probably got more common ground than uncommon ground, and maybe this is the problem that we have, you and I, because I think we can look at this perhaps a little bit more dispassionately, because there is so much passion tied into the Brexit argument. So let me tell you where I think you stand, then you tell me where you think I stand. How about that for a way of doing this? I think you think the EU was a bad idea once it got beyond the idea of a common market. In fact, I'm not even sure you think the common market is a good idea because...
I know, the common market was a good idea.
Okay. All right. But then, like a lot of people, you believe it became too political, and you believe that when Britain leaves, the EU will fall apart. That was your belief. So you wanted Britain to leave because you saw it as being an end to the EU.
Yeah, that's true. I thought it was possible that my way of phrasing it was I'd rather have a polite end to the particularly the Eurozone, but the overall agenda of the European Commission with a polite exit by Britain rather than a rude one by France or Italy. Right. But it looks like so much for polite. It's been a total farce.
So where do I sit? What's my take on all of this then? As far as you,
well, I thought you were very strongly in favour of the common market itself. You thought the transition cost would be enormous, and I think you sort of saw potentially the Brexit campaign was a form of internal right-wing coup.
Yeah, pretty much. And and is it worth it at the end of the day? Because I don't believe if we leave the EU will fall apart. I think it will.
Well, I think that's one I've got to concede to you because it's still, it isn't exactly standing on the podium holding the gold medal, but it's still intact. And that's even after we have the election originally of what was a potentially anti-European Union coalition in Italy, and that's how.
Also, is it? I mean, in fact, is it going to find that the things we don't like about the EU are they going to become, which is sort of like this, greater control and less sovereignty with Britain out of the argument? Is it going to go more down that road? In fact, is it going to become, the things that you don't like about the EU, are they going to become worse for the countries inside the EU? It's possible, isn't it?
Well. It's possible. I mean, to me, I think we just said what has happened through the whole process has been a classic case of the just dysfunctionality of the British political system overall. And I mean, I used to joke when I first arrived after spending some time in the UK that I'm not amazed that Britain lost an empire. I'm amazed that it found one in the first place.
But it has been tackling an impossible question, hasn't it? And because it all does get back to the whole thing about the border with Ireland.
That I must admit, that's one area that I did not fully appreciate.
Well, neither did anybody, and that's the bizarre thing, isn't it?
That's true. Yeah, and which is ridiculous.
And even in amongst all of this, even if we sort that out, no one's talking about Gibraltar. What the hell happens there? There's a bit of Britain sitting in the middle of Europe as well.
Yeah, that could fall off the edge of the map and nobody'd worry. I mean, that we don't expect the Gibraltarians to start leading internal bombing campaigns against each other or going across the water and dropping them in Portugal or Spain.
But it can happen in Ireland, absolutely.
It can happen in Ireland. That is one of those incredibly fragile situations. You have to take your hat off to the groups, that the individuals who led ultimately to the troubles being ended. I don't quite know how to phrase that.
Yeah, with the Good Friday Agreement.
With a true achievement, going against an ingrained level of animosity that goes back virtually half a millennium, and which is still absolutely bubbling near the surface.
Well, isn't there the danger that all of that is now going to be demolished? Because there is no answer to this Irish border. That is the problem. And if you look at the answer that Boris Johnson has come up with, which is in effect saying, well, let's move that Irish border so that it's actually a border between Northern Ireland and the mainland, we know that's not going to stick. So I don't think the deal that he's got, even if he manages to get a majority in Parliament, I don't think that's going to stick. And if it does stick, it's not going to stick around. It's not going to be the permanent arrangement.
Well, it would be a feasible permanent arrangement if all the parties in the island of Ireland were willing to tolerate it. But of course, the DUP, their opposition to it is because if they have something different about the island of Ireland versus Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the United Kingdom, then they see that as the first step towards an integration with the Republic of Ireland. They are opposed,
even though they were conveniently happy to have different laws, like, for example, abortion, which they were unaligned. Britain was aligned with the Republic of Ireland,
with the European Union. That's true.
More than Northern Ireland was. But look, but what we've got now is an administrative nightmare, isn't it? Because we're going to have goods that come out of the UK, out of Great Britain, I should say, that go to Northern Ireland. Now we're going to have taxes collected on them and tariffed as though, if they're of a reasonable quantity, as though they are heading to Europe. And then if they stay in Northern Ireland, they're going to claim the tax, the recipient is claiming the tax back on it. So that if that was a small amount of goods, then that would be fine. But in fact, Northern Ireland buys $13.3 billion of goods from Great Britain. It only buys $2.6 billion from Ireland. So in fact, we're putting a burden of administration on where the vast majority of goods is going, and that's going to be a huge cost, isn't it? So all that, you can only assume that means costs of goods is going to go up for people in Northern Ireland, or they start buying from the Irish Republic rather than buying from mainland Britain.
Yeah, or you have the cost being absorbed by the British Treasury, which it should do, because the whole reason for the double arrangement is to enable Britain to do what Britain voted. Largely, actually, it was the middle of England and part of the south that were the main areas voting for Brexit in terms of majority.
No, north of England, staunchly north of England. The south was a bit of a mix. Obviously, London was very much Remain. You get down to the southwest and you get into Brexit territory, but the Brexit heartland is definitely the north of England, apart from Liverpool.
Which, of course, makes it the pre-industrial belt, the belt that suffered under Thatcherism, and so in that sense, their vote, as has been said many times by others, was fundamentally a vote against austerity. Yeah, because they're the ones who've burned the brand, not just the shutting down of the industrial sector of the UK, which began under Maggie. Well, it was made into an objective of policy under Maggie Thatcher. Was happening beforehand in many ways as well. But those are the people who suffered, first of all, under 30 years of, generally speaking, Tory-ish government, and then saw themselves as suffering under the European Union as well, and basically wanted to kick anybody in the proverbials who said, if you don't vote this way, you'll lose all that. And they said, we should be worried about losing this. hence they vote for Brexit. Now, of course, the campaign that Boris is leading is trying to
say an end to it.
Meld that.
Absolutely.
Well, trying to meld that group with the sort of empiric remnants of the Tory party, which is a ridiculous political coalition when you think about it.
Well, I mean, what he's doing, in fact, is taking what it's just politicking, pure and simple, isn't it? He's taking what Jeremy Corbyn said last time. So he's saying, yeah, we're going to put more money into the health service, we're going to put more money back into police, we're going to put more money into education, and forget about the fact that he's heading the government that led austerity for so many years, because obviously politicking, they see, well, that's the way we're going to take the Brexiteers who are voting Labour at the moment. Let's get them over to the Tory side for the first time, perhaps in their life.
And that's what I've always seen as being Boris Johnson's campaign, because the Remain versus Exit Brexit camp split the other political parties, including the Tories for that matter. But if he can unite the Tories behind him and then exploit the divided vote between Labour, SNP, and the other parties, then, and including the Brexit party now, saying he's more Brexit than Brexit, then he wins a landslide and becomes his ambition Churchill Mark II. But the
it's and is he going to pull it off? He probably will, because people believe him, because he's charismatic and people like charismatic people, irrespective of what comes out of their mouth, it seems. But do you still think it's a good idea? So you voted presumably to leave.
Yeah.
I didn't.
Yeah, I voted to leave.
I didn't vote because I wasn't allowed to, because even though I'm more British than you are, I wasn't living
Definitely you are.
I wasn't living in the right country at the time. So
you were overseas, were you?
I was a few weeks before I moved back to the UK, and because I've been overseas for more than 15 years, I couldn't vote, like lots of people in Europe couldn't vote. So and like Europeans living in England couldn't vote for that particular referendum, even though they can vote in local council elections. So we know who they are, but go figure.
Yeah, no, I voted for it, largely without looking at the potential impact on the UK, because I simply want to see. I call myself a Groucho Marxist over this. I didn't want to be a member of a club like the European Union. If there's a way of getting out, then let's take advantage of it. I didn't expect the vote to win. Again, the polls were misleading. The polls implied Remain would be not a comfortable victory, but would win overall. So it was a surprise to everybody when it went through. I hadn't thought about the Northern Ireland issue thoroughly. My position mainly was that what determines the economic performance of a country is fundamentally its investment level. What determines the current rate of economic growth or economic whether the economy is rising or falling is fundamentally credit, not the international trade situation. You remember at the time Lagarde and all the various official bodies were coming up predicting an absolute catastrophe for the economy if Brexit won, and of course it sailed right through with no particular impact. So that's one time.
Apart from the value of the pound, that was really the only
But then again, there are good arguments, and John Mills has been making these for a long, long time. The pound is overvalued courtesy of the impact of the financial sector on the value of the pound itself, and that's undermining manufacturing. And if you need to get manufacturing going, one of the many factors necessary to rebuild the manufacturing sector in the UK is the lower value of the pound. So I saw that as a useful side effect of Brexit rather than anything.
Although the fact the pound, every time there's talk of some sort of deal, the pound starts to bounce back. Maybe not as far as it was before we left, but sometimes not far from it. It's only when there's talk of a no deal that the pound starts to sag a little. But do you think, let's talk about trade, because we can talk about investment as well. But I mean, 45% of our exports in goods and services go to the EU. 53% of our imports come from the EU. All tariff-free, obviously. It would surely hurt if we were to lose that relationship, wouldn't it?
It had hurt a bit, but not a lot. I mean, the tariffs are nothing like what they used to be back in the 50s and 60s. People talk about how, again, this is the whole obsession with comparative advantage and the belief that specialisation is what drives economic performance. I've always regarded that as a load of codswallop, and it's what drives economic performance is investment, fundamentally. And in fact, when you look at the history of development for including the major nations of the planet these days, including the UK for that matter, and also United States, Germany, Japan, China itself, they all succeeded by a period of protecting their domestic industries in some fashion, but simultaneously putting them under pressure to innovate and become globally competitive over time.
Right, but if you're saying, we know the history of Japan, absolutely. But on that basis, high tariffs help to nurture industries, to help them to develop, and it's stood them in good stead over time. But I mean, the fact if the tariffs aren't so great, that means that it's unlikely if you to see those tariffs emerge, it's going to change the structure of British industry. We're not going to start manufacturing stuff that we see being manufactured or grown very often in Europe, are we?
No, but what we're likely to, I think what's more likely to hit us is the impact on international trade of realising how serious the climate situation is. That'll play the role of tariffs this time round. But in terms of changing the focus away from...
Hang on, but how do you mean by that? In what way?
We'll be banning international trade at some point because of the impact of pollution.
Right, because things have to travel so far. Well, in which case we'll be buying stuff from Europe because that's nice and close, rather than, for example, the 15 to 18% of trade we do with the United States.
I have no desire to leave the European. There's an advantage in terms of a large free trade zone for a continent like Europe. The same sense America got out of it, being a continental power. It was possible for, first we had a common culture, relatively common culture across the entire country, certainly a common language, a common administration, and that gave you enormous economies of scale, which enabled companies like Boeing and so on to develop over time. And a large part of the ambition of forming the European Union, and you can still see it in today's rhetoric, is about building something which is economically equivalent to the United States of Europe, even though you can't make a political United States of Europe. And the economic argument for that in terms of economies of scale is quite valid. So I could see an argument in favour of remaining in that while leaving the elements of the European Union which are a catastrophe, which are fundamentally the focus that have been imposed by conventional economists in the European Commission. In favour of austerity.
So that's not the structure necessarily. That's just the way it's been applied. That is the fact that the bigwigs in Europe have been listening too much to those economists.
But there's also an element of the politics itself being part of it, because Milton Friedman even made this case very well when he argued against the idea of the euro currency, and that is that you have to have, as well as a central bank, you have to have treasuries that enable taxes to government spending to be net putting a deficit into parts of the country that are economically suffering because of industrial development and so on, and maybe taxing the areas that are growing. So if you look at what's happened in America, I don't know what the trade balance is between California and Arkansas, but I'm sure California exports more to Arkansas than back in the other direction. Nobody knows and nobody cares in one sense, because all the things like welfare payments and so on, not enough of them, frankly, but they're paid out of the national budget rather than out of the local budget. So,
look at the UK. There's a big north-south divide, and obviously far more welfare payments going up north, and a lot of the wealth is being generated in the south.
So if you think about Europe on the same front, that was going to be effective in Europe. You need to have a much, much larger government, central government, and relatively smaller, what are currently national governments, but effectively are state governments, given the fact that they can't create their own money. Now,
and we spoke about this recently in a recent podcast. And in fact, we talked about it in the context of Europe, because Mario Draghi had been saying, well, maybe when we were talking about modern monetary theory, we talked about this, because Mario Draghi had been saying, well, maybe we need to be looking at things like MMT, which would mean, providing more fiscal support, which would mean you would need a more centralized EU to divvy up those funds. Yeah.
And again, then you get the cultural difficulties. At that stage, you'd need to have Germans being willing to pay taxes to the benefit of Greeks. Of course, if you went back 60 years, you'd need to have Greeks willing to pay taxes for the benefit of Germans. That little detail seems to have been forgotten now, and people would have resentment about taxes being effectively higher in the region we call Germany and lower in the region we call Greece. If you actually went to having a centralized treasury that could match the centralized currency. But I think it's just was always a mistake. The trouble is the public really enjoyed the euro because it means you can travel anywhere in continental Europe and use the same currency.
But shouldn't Germany be taxed more? Because if you look at who's benefiting from the euro, obviously it's Germany. They're exporting more because the euro is worth less than the Deutschmark be.
They've been the beneficiaries overall, without a doubt.
So in that case,
yes,
shouldn't we give it? If a case can be made for that, then
but
the case can be made to say, well, Germany should be putting more into the central pot.
Yeah, and it's a case I wouldn't like to go argue in Bonn. Again, it's these things are politically just not feasible, and that's the problem. I think the whole project to get beyond where it is now to actually being a viable state is not politically feasible. So the European Union is going to continue being a region which underperforms because it's been designed to underperform. And in that case, I say, well, the best thing to do is, that's something which moves us towards breaking it up in such a way you can go back to national currencies. But one thing I'd like to have in that case, continue the euro for international trade, have the national currencies reborn. But when you travel from one country to another and you exchange lira for franc, it's done by the central banks at 100% of the exchange rate. None of this rip-offs that annoy consumers when they go from one country to another.
And we've spoken about that before as well. So the idea of the euro existing as a sort of like a trading currency within Europe, and each country goes back to printing its own currency. And it gets tagged, does it, or does it? Well,
it'd just be a case the central banks would run all the currency exchanges inside Europe.
Right. Okay. So
that'd be simple.
Back to how things were, but which is going back to how things were with the EQ beforehand,
but with the additional feature, one of the reasons you're so attractive. Consumers like having they have no monetary costs if they take the euro from Germany to Italy. Right. If you're going to bring back national currency, you need the same effect on national currencies.
Right. So I'm trying to figure out what it would take for you in that vote to have said, actually, I want to stay. So if the euro didn't exist,
just avoiding what's happening with Northern Ireland. That's it. If I had experienced Northern Ireland before the vote, I think about my first couple of trips to Northern Ireland after the vote, you just get this feeling this is the powder keg, and the last thing you want to do is drop anything even resembling a spark within reach of it. Right. And that's what Brexit potentially is.
So apart from the Northern Ireland issue, which is a big concern, so obviously it sounds like you're saying, well, maybe it's not such a good idea then because we don't want to have that powder keg go off to ignite. Aside from that, if the euro didn't exist, or if there was a move by Europe to say, well, let's go back to sovereign currencies with the euro as a trading currency within the Eurozone, would you then be saying, well, okay, happy with that, I'd vote Remain?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. To me, it's the fallacies, the flaws in the European Union that are, and particularly the Eurozone, that are a reason not to be part of the whole thing. Again, like one thing, let's be politically incorrect here. The whole idea of free movement.
You make it sound like it's a new departure for us.
Just making a bit of a flag for the warning. But I'm not in favour of complete free movement either. Right. I think there is an extent to which you want to be able to maintain. I'm a great fan of migration in terms of how it's affected. If you remember Australia, what a boring, you don't know how boring it was before you turned up. I remember when it was an Anglo-Saxon country, and my God, was it dull. You could actually, the national flag would have been replaced with a chop and 3 vegetables, and nobody would have noticed.
I was shocked actually when, and then obviously, influx of Chinese and a lot of other nationalities, and it becomes a far more interesting place. I was shocked actually.
Dramatically better.
My relatives in Queensland, when I arrived and was introduced to them all, they were saying, great to see, and this is awful. This is
go ahead. Yep.
They were saying, great to see more white faces turning up here. We're sick of all these other people moving in. About time we had more Brits, and I was there going, well, I don't know as I agree with that. Surely, we're all individuals, but that was the attitude at the time. That was the 90s.
They think there's something in not just in humanity, but in species in general, which leads to a slight rejection of the other, which is part of how speciation actually comes about. So in terms of saying we've got to be but we can't call it racism though when you're looking at Germans or French. They are, there's no difference apart from that they speak a different language. Again, it's a cultural thing as well as anything vaguely resembling ethnicity. And culture, I think, is far more dominant these days than the ethnicity issue. But cultures need a certain amount of inertia to have momentum at the same time to enable the continuity. And when you want to have people, a rate of migration can potentially overwhelm that. In some cases, you want that to happen. I think the what happened in a cultural sense to Australia during the early days of multiculturalism was fabulous. But you don't want to come to the stage where it overwhelms you, because, again, this is something we've seen in research into reactions to new waves of migration. It's the most recent migrants who are most opposed to the next wave of migration.
Yes, always.
Largely because their jobs are the ones which are vulnerable to the new wave of migration. So the whole idea of free movement, and of course it mainly wasn't free movement of labour as much as free movement of capital. There's an extent to which you want to have restrictions there, again, because a certain amount of variation and diversity is part of a well-functioning biological system, and economics has made the huge mistake of pretending it's non-biological.
Well, doesn't it? Won't it level itself out a little bit, though? So if you had, first of all, let's get the definitions right. So if we talk about a free movement of labour, i.e. you can move to another country within the EU if you've got a job, or with a prospect of a job within a few months. So you can't claim welfare. You can only go there and earn money. And if you find everyone's moving to a particular area, then isn't it going to be the case that then they are going to demand higher wages because there's going to be a surplus of labour? They're going to demand higher wages, and then all of a sudden companies are going to say, oh, well, there's no point in being there. We might as well be in another part of the European Union.
It's actually the opposite effect applies. What you've got is people moving to areas where the wages are higher and depopulating the remaining areas. And people.
So why wouldn't companies say, well, okay, let's go to those areas where because there's less labour, I guess.
And there's less demand as well.
But if you've got mobility of labour, then people would move back to those areas. So we've seen 10. For example, we've seen this 10% drop in the population or more, I think, of the population of Greece, and a lot of it is that's the whole population. If you look at the working age population, it's much more. But companies said, well, okay,
and that actually leads to a decline. It actually destroys Greece ultimately. I mean,
but why wouldn't companies say, well, let's move to Greece because there's not many people there. We don't have to pay them much because they'll be grateful for a job.
For the same reason, all the Italian restaurants in Sydney are in Norton Street. There's a hint for travellers. There's a congregation effect, and that is a viable society will generate those little concentrations. And if you have people leaving an area, it tends to continue leaving. It's applying on a large scale the work of a guy called Hotelling about the locational aspects of economics. Yeah. And there are arguments. You don't want to have free movement, for example, this is the classic illustration, free movements of ice cream stands on a beach, because they'll move towards each other to try to take each other's competition. And ultimately, all the ice cream is spoiled from one location on the beach. You'd rather force it to be distributed along the whole promenade so people don't have to walk so far to get their ice creams. That is a locational reason to have some controls over free movement, both of labour and capital.
Okay.
So I think there's...
I take your point. So companies need suppliers as well. There's the whole supply chain thing, and you want to be close to your supply chain, which of course is another issue where we've got to be concerned about the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, because how much stuff is going backwards and forwards across those borders, which is why it needed to be resolved, which perhaps this agreement does resolve, and a no-deal Brexit wouldn't. In fact, a no-deal Brexit would put a border right across Ireland and return to violence, and all of those supply chain issues would return. But look, if we don't get a resolution, I think there's a real chance that this is an unresolvable problem, even with Boris's interim agreement. This is just a stepping stone to the final agreement, and his hope is that we are going to get a final agreement which will basically see tariff-free trade between Britain and the rest of Europe. But that's not going to fly, is it? Because that's like being a member of the club without paying membership of it. So, it's the whole idea that it's not going to fly. I mean, this is the trouble. We have an impossible situation, and it's, of course, it's led political paralysis in the UK. Yeah, because it's impossible. So how much is it? Yeah. How much is it going to hurt? So let me give you a few facts and figures. I know you like it when I give you facts and figures. And do indeed. So mate, your facts and figures, they're just gorgeous. 10% of what we export to the EU is cars. Cars would have, in a no-deal Brexit, a 10% EU tariff on them. At the same time, Japan has a free trade deal now with the European Union. Over the next 10 years, they're going to have free trade, zero tariffs between Japan and the EU. Japanese manufacturers account for more than 40% of British car outputs. At the same time, we've also got, this move to electric cars as well. So you're having to retool. If you're having to retool a factory in, I don't know, let's say, for example, Sunderland, which was overwhelmingly a Remain vote area, and you've got the prospect of making it a home with it's got to travel further, but you've got that whole proximity argument in terms of the technology, and you can export without any tariffs into the EU, or you could do it outside the EU in the UK and face a 10% tariff. What are you going to do? Surely you're going to close your UK car plants down, aren't you?
Quite possibly, yeah. I mean, there are potential damages like that, particularly, again, if you've got this, the obsession with free trade in general means that if you're stuck behind tariff walls and others aren't, then you have obviously a massive handicap. But 10%, I mean, back when I was involved with the trade union movement and the whole issue of protection in Australia, tariffs were the order of 40 and 50%. And of course, those are the level of tariffs that Donald Trump is throwing down right now in his battles with China and Germany.
10%. Actually, I mean, this is a point Nigel Farage makes, and I hate to support anything Nigel Farage says, but he says, that things like that will disappear because of the weakness in the pound. So.
10% is not the sort of change that can't be wiped out by a currency alteration. 30% and 40%, you're talking a more serious fall. But something in the order of 10%, relatively minor price adjustments are going to be the issue there.
So long as we have a weaker pound. But how long is the finance sector going to be happy with a weaker pound, for example?
Well, I really care about the happiness of the financial sector.
I know, but I'm just talking about where the power sits. Okay, another one. Let me give you another one. Dairy products. 43.7% tariff on dairy products into the EU. 1.6 billion pounds of our dairy products are exported, and 78% of that in value goes to the EU. That's an industry that's going to be decimated.
Yep, that's something you can't get over with just a currency fall. Definitely, that's pretty huge.
Sugars and confectionery. 27.5% tariff. 73% of our chocolate exports go to the EU. That's about $400 million worth of products. So Terrier's chocolate orange and Roundtree Macintosh and all that sort of stuff made here. That's another industry that's surely going to suffer. 27.5% tariff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm normally reacting to knowing that, generally speaking, tariffs are well below 10%. When you're talking in the 25 and 30 and 40% range, yes, then going from no tariff to something of that scale is going to be a whammy on your business.
So, and this whole thing about gravity models, because we look at and say, well, okay, we'll do more trade with the US, and we have Donald Trump saying he's going to give us the best trade deal ever. I wonder if he realizes that we actually have a trade surplus with them, and he's obviously going to want to correct that. But gravity models have got to be fairly important in all of this, hasn't it? The fact that it is a lot easier to trade, and you mentioned climate change. The fact it's a lot easier to trade with people who are just over the channel rather than across an ocean.
Oh yeah, and I think it's going to be a growing trend, given the climate situation over the next 20 or so years. That it's going to be long range trips, which are putting large amounts of goods in diesel powered vessels. I think that's going to become a no-no, and there'll be a lot of force to bring stuff back to either local within national borders or not particularly far. And of course, the channel qualifies as not particularly far, and we have the tunnel link there as well as the across the channel. So. It does make sense. And
you've spoken a lot about sort of complexity models. How much industries work with other industries to develop products. If you're isolated from, you don't have a particularly complex network of infrastructure businesses, then it's harder for you to create any goods whatsoever. I mean, you'd have to look at the complexity across the whole of Europe, wouldn't you, and treat that as one, which is going to be far more complex than the complexity you'd see of industry within the UK. And it's going to be hard for the UK to replicate that, to be able to, even if it wanted to produce stuff domestically, it's going to be harder for it to do that without the rest of Europe involved in that supply chain.
At the same time, you have very high complexity ratings for a country like Switzerland, which has done very well keeping out of virtually everything in Europe for its history. And like Norway as well, a very high rating there because they have reinvested their oil surplus back into their industrial capability to mine the oil, and then they've been in an entire industrial machine tool industry, which England would have UK would every right in envying because it's so much better than what's left in the UK. So those sorts of issues
It's a much smaller economy, though, than ours, isn't it? I mean,
much smaller, actually, I'll leave you to check that particular one up. But I've got a feeling its complexity rating going to be certainly within reach of the UK, which should not be the case given the relative difference in scale.
Yeah. So, do you think then that Europe's held us back in that case? We should have a higher complexity rating, but we haven't because we've become lazy because so much else is done within continental Europe.
That is quite feasible. Certainly, turning away from manufacturing is a large part of the what there was of a British embrace of the European Union. And what you saw is over that period of time, pretty much the last 35 years, manufacturing has gone from being 20% of the UK economy to 10%, while it's remained at 20% of the German economy. So partly the English is fell for the lazy. We'll specialise in services. They can specialise in manufacturing. To me, that's always been a fallacy. One of my favourite little sayings is that there is such a thing as a post-industrial society. It's called hunting and gathering.
Well, a lot of our industrial society, of course, is up north, and a lot of it is now funded from foreign direct investment, like, for example, Japanese car plants, and it is then exported to Europe. So if we look, the impact, if there is indeed any impact at all from tariffs, so I'll ask you about that in a second. You sort of half answered that question. But 61% of goods exported from Wales and Northern Ireland go to the EU. In the northeastern Yorkshire, it's 60% of goods. It's a lot less as a percentage of goods from the south of England. So actually, the regions that voted to leave are the ones that are most dependent on producing goods which are exported to the European Union. So that sounds a bit like Turkey's voting for Christmas, unless, as I think you're trying to say, well, let's not get too hung up about the tariffs because they're probably not going to have too much impact.
Yeah, to me, it's a scale of impact is not as great as people are worried about. If you had your government spending and investment was substantially large, then that sort of dropping out of a trade bloc would not be a major issue. It wouldn't cause a total social breakdown, which is the way it was being presented. By the way, just into those complexity rankings, number one in the list is Japan. Number two is Switzerland. The UK is actually higher up than I thought it might be. It's number 14, well ahead of Norway, but again, the population difference factor of 10 to 1. Norway number 40. So Norway's well and truly competing above its weight. The UK, in terms of complexity, is pretty miserable.
Right. Well, so there we are. But what do they make in Switzerland? Maybe we can undercut them on cuckoo clocks. Because our labour's going to be so much cheaper. Or tennis players. Yeah, what else do they make?
An enormous amount, obviously, which again, they have focused upon their industrial base and technology in innovation and manufacturing, and the UK has let it wither.
But would it return? That is the question. Are we going to find that after an uncomfortable period, Britain will get back to manufacturing? It's the chicken and egg argument, isn't it? We get back to the one about tariffs. If the tariffs aren't that great, who cares? It's not going to be enough of an incentive to reindustrialize.
That's the danger. I mean, there's no guarantee that...
So we want the EU to put their tariffs up. It'll make everything more expensive, but it'll force us to do more ourselves.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to be forced over. That's one thing I expect to see with the climate change over time, being literally forced to do more for yourself because the carbon cost of importing will become regarded as too excessive, and we'll have policies blocking those, which might as well be tariffs in their effect. But yes, whether the UK can actually reindustrialise, a very, very big question.
So so two questions to finish with, and I'll answer them as well. The questions are, what do you think is going to happen in the end, and what should happen? My answers are, well, I think we should stay in and try and drive change within, because it's always because circumstances will change, and politics will change, and personalities will change over time. So nothing we're looking at in an institution is just a structure, and it can be changed by the people who form part of that structure. As to what's going to happen, I suspect that we're going to be locked in deadlock for another year. The government is never going to agree anything. We're going to have a hung parliament. They're not going to agree. There'll be another people's vote, and I suspect we probably will remain.
Yeah, I think Remain's going to be the outcome as well. But
and is that the best? And is that the best? What would you really like? How would you solve this problem if you were?
Well, Northern Ireland to me just means that we should never have had the vote in the first place. That is that's the bottom line for me. So that's
unless we can convince Ireland to leave.
Give good luck with that. If I'd known the Northern Ireland situation more thoroughly, and suddenly if I'd seen the level of confusion that's been caused by this whole thing, I would have not even bothered voting. I would have, effectively joined you back in Australia again to avoid being there for the vote. But I think it's going to come to nothing. I think we're going to be stuck in the same quandary because there's no way. We're more likely to see another hung parliament after this one than I think a victorious one. We were all talking about Boris Johnson being a campaigner and having charisma and so on. But this is the place where we take the battle out of the arena of Parliament, where the procedures and rules are very much in favour of the government of the day, and you go on the hustlings. And we saw how effective Jeremy Corbyn was last time round versus Theresa May.
Because the media controls. Because the media has to report each side equally, and so you have a balanced debate.
Compared to what happens right now.
Compared to what happens normally, where it's who the most charismatic person gets the most airtime.
Yeah, so what we're really saying, we're finishing up the discussion by discussing how we think the election's going to go.
I know. Well, it's going to be a hung parliament.
I think it'll be a hung parliament, most likely. Yeah, I certainly don't see a landslide victory for Johnson. That's what he's going to campaign to get, however.
Right. So anyway, I've got my answer. If you had the chance to vote again, you would vote Remain. Yeah. Because of the whole Northern Ireland situation.
Ireland, fundamentally, yes.
Yeah. Oh, well, there we are. We agree at the end. Good to talk, Steve.
Brexhaustion. We forgot Brexhaustion.
Brexhaustion. We've certainly got all of that.
Yeah, we're definitely Brexhausted. Yeah.
Right, that's it. We've done Brexit. We don't need to do it ever again in our lives. We'll catch you again next week. See you soon.
Okay.
I'm glad we sorted all that out. Now, next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen, we will be looking at the pay gap. Can it ever be bridged? Are we making any headway? And if so, what's the best way of tackling this issue? We'll look at all of that next time on the Debunking Economics podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie. I'll be back then too. Thanks for listening.